So today we want to talk about something that is quite unusual for engineers and for computer scientists, which is the ethics. And it's not necessarily the reason that you have a powerful technology that you should occupy yourself with ethics, but also you can have just a simple knife, and the question of ethics could be relevant. What can you do with that knife? But if you have a powerful technology like AI, perhaps this becomes more pressing to look at ethical questions. One of the approaches that I have seen in recent 2-3 years is to look at cases and things that go wrong and talk about them. And one has to do that. But I want to go a little bit deeper and first establish a base to see, because these questions are not new. So today we will try to basically get a big picture of the ethics in philosophy, and then hopefully next week on Tuesday, then we come up with explicit examples that show what could go wrong ethically when we use and apply AI technologies. So today it could be really a little bit difficult because we want to cover 2,000 years of considerations in less than 2 hours, so it will be a little bit challenging, but I will stay on the surface, so I will not go deep, which for each one of those topics you can go. So we are talking about the question of ethics, and for the question of ethics, we are looking at philosophy. So we could look at the question of religion, but we don't do that because we are in an academic environment. Philosophy is basically the interpretation of religious matters that we have accepted as scientific framework, sort of. So we stick with philosophy. Most philosophers had some sort of religious beliefs, of course. So philosophy works and deals with three main branches, if I can call it branches. The first major one is ontology, sometimes is called cosmology. So, and it's dealing with the question of, fundamental question of being and existence. So, why we are here? So, really fundamental questions for Homo sapiens. And of course, the question of reality, the question of universe, and of course, the question of God. So as the label that we put on the idea that things may have meaning. So ontology deals with those type of questions, really the most fundamental questions that anybody can come up with. So why we are here? So what is our life about? So is there a meaning? Is there some sort of supreme intelligence governing the universe in terms of physical laws or supernatural phenomena? So what is it? So people have been thinking about these questions for many, many centuries. The second branch of philosophy talks about epistemology. So epistemology deals with how do we perceive reality. So perception of reality. And of course, it's about knowledge. So how much knowledge can we gain? Can we trust our perceptions when we look at the society, when we look at the relationships between humans, between human and animals, human and nature? Is there such a thing as reality, and we perceive it? And if we perceive it, how do we perceive it? So can we trust our senses? Because if you want to answer, especially the ontological question, maybe you need certain level of knowledge to answer that. Where do you get that knowledge? How do you know that that knowledge is reliable, is correct? Very, very fundamental question. And of course, the last one is axiology, which is basically ethics. So axiology deals with morale and aesthetics. Aesthetics. So the main thing is what is right or wrong, or what has value. So axiology is dealing with what has value. So which value is, if you have not some answer for the ontological question and you don't have some answer for the epistemological side of things, where do you get your knowledge? How reliable is the knowledge? Can I trust the knowledge? Then perhaps I cannot define values. So what are values? And of course, values in the aesthetics, values are art. So why is a painting beautiful? So why do we like arts? And what is beautiful in general? So from ethical question perspective, most of the time, most people use morality and ethics interchangeably. So we mean basically the same thing, so as we talk about it. So in order to get to, so we want to get some idea about here, and it's very difficult because these are actually not separate things. So you cannot establish values without having some answer for the question, the perception of reality. How do you perceive the reality? If that's flawed, you cannot have reliable answers for value. And if you don't know what you're doing in this universe, what does it matter? What is ethical or not? So it's really something fundamental that people like me would say this is not just for the Department of Philosophy or Religious Studies across the campus. This is a question for everybody. So you don't need a PhD to think about this sort of stuff. You should think about this sort of stuff. Now, how do we find answers? Well, there are basically two approaches. One is you come up with a theory. Well, how do you come up with a theory? You sit down and think about it. You read many books, which is very common in philosophical domain. You have to have read everything, started from Socrates and Plato up to everybody else in the 21st century. Then you can come up with some theory. Based on that theory, you establish a hypothesis. From the hypothesis, you can derive some observations. So you make some observations, and then you seek to find confirmation for those observations. And you can build then a loop between your confirmations that are based on observation. Observation could be statistics, could be experimental verification, large-scale studies, and so on. So this approach, and go back to the theory and do it again to refine your theory. So this is called deduction. So you may follow a deductive approach to finding a question, to finding an answer to ethical questions. So you may sit down and come up with a theory, and many have, that some of them that we talk about have done this. So you sit down, come up with a theory. Based on your theory, you establish a hypothesis, what is right, what is wrong. You make some observation in the human society, find confirmations for your hypothesis, and then maybe readjust your theory. Many philosophers have done that. So another way of finding answer is starting with observation. Then, based on the observation, you establish the patterns that you think you see, the patterns that you see in the society, the behavioral pattern that you see in the society. And based on those patterns, you come up with some tentative hypothesis, which you may not be able to hold, so you will keep it. And based on those hypotheses, you establish your overall theory. And if you need, you go back from your theory to the observation to refine things in a loop, which may not be an explicit loop as we know it from the programming. So it's an implicit loop. it takes 30 years to refine something like that, 40 years, 20 years, and so on. So that we call induction. So you may follow an inductive approach to finding questions. So it should be clear which way you are going. So sometimes it may not be very obvious which way we are going to find answers to ethical questions. So, and the question is, again, so fundamentally for us, what is right, what is wrong? So hopefully next week we can answer to some of those questions. So if I build a robot that can go in and kill people, is that right or wrong? So it may be right. So maybe I am doing it for my fatherland, and I think fatherland is the highest value. So if the highest value is the fatherland, then killing people that do not belong to my fatherland is right. So depending on, you can see that things start falling apart in terms of that people will not agree with each other. And that's perhaps the most challenging domain in the human society that we have to find answers. So I thought maybe we go back 2,000 years ago. I want to stay within the Western philosophy. I don't want to go into Eastern philosophy for several reasons. It happens that the views are divided. Eastern philosophy has its own set of ethics. Western philosophy has its own. We think it's a divide. There is a divide in literature, at least. So I do not mention anything from East. I could easily. Actually, I could more easily mention examples from the East, starting from China to India to Middle East, than from the West. But I think we should stay inside the West because we are working in the Western hemisphere. We should think about things that people accept. So that's my only argument, to stay inside Western philosophy. But we will see, I will here and there, I point to the facts that you cannot really separate this sort of stuff. So then I would inevitably start with Socrates. So Socrates, around 470 BC, we know Socrates from the so-called Socratic method, which is getting to bottom of things by asking questions. So his method of inquiry actually got him killed. So we put him in jail and we forced him to drink poison. So he died because he was teaching the young people of Athens to ask questions, such an outrageous thing. So ask questions. So ask, and 2,000 years, 2,500 years after Socrates, actually asking questions is still, to lip service, we say, yes, asking questions is good, but practically in the human society, is not welcome to ask questions, especially if you are dealing with established notion of things. Nobody likes his traditions and culture being questioned. Nobody likes that. So we say that we honor this, but actually the traces of Socratic method and philosophy have been lost in the Western philosophy. Many things that I say is my perception. You have to be clear about that. So people call it that you get a series of questions, of questionings, and instructions leading to elicit a clear representation of what should be actually known to all rational beings. So what Socrates was saying was this. There are many things that if you are a rational being, and he assumes that most of us can be rational. What means rational? Rational is perception of reality without any filter. No judgment, no filtering, no cultural influence on it. So you just see the bare-bone reality. And he's saying that if you're a rational being, actually you should know. But maybe all biases that we have do not let us to know. So by questioning and inquiry, we should get to the bottom of it. And something that is already known, you can get to it by questioning. So unfortunately, I think that we have completely misunderstood Socrates. So one group that teaches some of the Socrates methods is not a method. Inquiry is not a method. Is inherent cognitive capability in every human being. So it's not a method. We have not invented inquiry. This is something completely misunderstood. So in law schools, people use that as a method of inquiry. How do I question my witness? How do I drive my opponent into the corner? So it has become actually a nasty technique, I would say. No, this is not what Socrates was about. But again, so you see that the influence of Socrates has sort of diminished. We say we like to ask questions, especially at the universities, but actually we don't. We don't like to question it. So, and every time that you question things, you will feel that people don't like that. Of course, right after Socrates, we have to talk about Plato, around 428 BC. So Plato was the disciple of Socrates, and he collected a lot of his writings. So in his dialogues, he recorded many discourses of Socrates. So if it wasn't for Plato, we didn't know much about Socrates. So that's for me the actual value of Plato. But I'm sure many would disagree with me. So if Plato has a place in human society, it's because he recorded what Socrates, what his teacher was saying. So, but this is not in his Apology. So he records the way that Socrates defends himself, which is a fantastic piece of literature to read. If you have time this summer, just grab the Apology and read it. So how Socrates will defend himself in front of the court. So, and his mistake was asking questions. So fantastic piece of literature. So, but when we talk about Plato and ethics, we talk about him because he talks about a perfect state. And he thinks the perfect state, which we still are looking for it, so what type of government is the best type of government? So he thinks the perfect state can be done that people are governed by intellectual, or maybe more accurate, by enlightened leaders. Well, as far as enlightened go, we are still waiting for that. So it has not happened. So it happens that people who go into politics are the one that with any measure, with any stretch of imagination can be called enlightened. So when you go in politics, you are a different type of you have a different type of thinking. So, but also another thing that perhaps when you read the Republic, maybe the main work of Plato, is the doctrine of ideas. Doctrine of ideas. Now, this is the Plato that continues to influence the Western society. The Plato of ideas. And what he says is quite outrageous, actually. So he says ideas are more important than material things. What does that mean? So, for example, you have an idea, the idea of justice. So he says justice is an idea. And he is right. So one of the things that I admire Plato for, he recognized when we talk about justice, justice is an idea. It's not a real thing. We have invented justice because we have some problems, and the justice, the idea to solve those problems. And he says, if you have a just idea of justice, then you come up with Constitution. You come up with Bill of Rights in US. And you come up with the Charter of Rights and Freedom in Canada. So those are the materialization of the idea of justice. But there would be no constitution if there was no idea of justice. So he put a lot of emphasis of this notion of idea. Now, what it means is that we put a lot of emphasis on thought. And again, you see here the divide between West and East, because West puts a lot of emphasis on thought and ideas. East doesn't. So today we don't want to talk about East, we are talking about West. And that influence of Plato is with us right now, today. On any campus, Plato is everywhere, in every philosophical department, because ideas are important. We put a lot of emphasis on ideas. So, of course, after Socrates and Plato, we cannot not talk about Aristotle. Aristotle, 384 BC. So he was the disciple of Plato. So now we are teacher after teacher, so things are getting handed down. So his main work is the so-called the Nicomachean Ethics. So his 10 short articles on ethics, and people call it Nicomachean because we guess somebody who edited those 10 books was Nicomachean, either his son or his father, because both of them were called Nicomachean. So that's the only reason that we call it Nicomachean Ethics. So, and this was, and that's why Aristotle is so big, not just in West, but also in East, because he was the first one that tried to really put a framework on things and try to go deep and define ethics, not just imply. So when you say perfect state, and you say people should be governed by enlightened leaders, you are putting some ethical values forward, but you are not explicitly saying what that means and what we should do. Aristotle was the first one who said, okay, let's sit down and put things in a framework, define it such that we know what is good, what is bad. So that's why Aristotle is so important everywhere. So he basically, when we talk about Aristotle, this is about virtue ethics. So what is a virtue and what is a vice? What is good and what is bad? So what is admirable and what is despicable? So very important, of course. So he started saying that happiness is the highest good. Well, it sounds like Buddha, but it is not. It's Aristotle that talks about happiness. So happiness is the highest good. So let's strive for happiness. Let's find happiness. So then if I say happiness is the highest good, everything that helps me to become happy is ethical and moral, and everything that prevents my happiness is not ethical. So it could be misunderstood easily, and we have spent then 2,000 years almost to clarify what Aristotle was saying. So I give you some examples from his virtues and vice. So if you're talking about action and feeling, so, and then he talks about, okay, either you have things in excess, which is then becoming a vice, or you find the golden you find the golden mean, which becomes then a virtue, or you don't have excess, you are deficient in something, deficiency, which also becoming a vice. So from any quality that you can imagine, you should find the golden middle to find it as a virtue, as ethical. If you go to the left or you go to the right, so either you have excess amount of it or not enough of it, then you become unethical, basically. So examples, so he talks about fear and confidence. Fear and confidence. So if you have a lot of it, so that's rashness. If you are in the golden middle, you are courageous, courage. If you don't have enough of it, you are a coward. So he tries to really define things in some sort of quasi-scientific way, putting some measurements on things. About pleasure and pain, so two topics that first of all are the same. Pleasure is the same thing as pain. There is no pleasure without pain. There is no pain without pleasure. And there is no ethics unless you answer the question of what type of pleasures are admissible and what type of pleasures are wrong. Just think about the corruption as the most obvious manifestation of unethical behavior in human society, which if you go and write the Professional Engineers of Ontario exam, they will ask you a question like this to see whether, okay, do you recognize that this would be corrupt if you give the contract to your family members? So if the corruption is the case, so then you are looking for your own pleasure. You want more money. You want more power. That's the reason that we become unethical. So pleasure is the fundamental thing to go after if you want to find answers for that. So licentiousness. So if you are permanently seeking pleasure in excess, the golden middle, temperance. Well, you are reasonable, you're a rational being. You know, there are innocent pleasures that I can have. Eating good food, for God's sake, is pleasure, but it's innocent pleasure. I'm not damaging anybody to just enjoy my own food. So deficiency in pleasure and pain, so you are insensible. Insensibility. Insensibility. So, and maybe one last example. Anger. Irascibility. So when you get easily upset, excessively upset and angry, so because you don't get what you want. And of course, the middle is patience. Patience is a virtue. It has become a proverb. So that was introduced by Aristotle. And if you don't have enough of it, lack of spirit. So what is the problem with that virtue ethics? So we will talk at the end about some of the critics and some of the problems. But one fundamental thing that separates, although he talks about happiness, and we don't know what happiness is, and then he tries to put it in perspective with respect to the virtues that can easily become a vice. He assumes you can measure this sort of stuff. That's the most fundamental objection of people from East to Aristotle. He assumes you can measure happiness. You can measure what is courage or what is not courage. So is it percentage-wise? How do you know? What does it mean, excess? So do you know exactly how to measure that? These are psychological entities. These are mental phenomena. How do you measure this type of stuff? So that's something that later on that many people try to shed light on after Aristotle. Okay. Well, these three guys and some others, this is, of course, my subjective selection. For some reason, for almost what? For a long time, nothing happened. The planet Earth was dead. Nobody was thinking about this sort of stuff. You have to get to 1225 to talk about Thomas Aquinas, the Italian philosopher and theologian. So for so many 1225 to 1274. So Thomas Aquinas was a theologian. So he was busy with religion. And he was in discussion with some Eastern philosophers like Averroes and the ideas of Avicenna about what is reason and how should we go about finding a path to ethics. Should we go with reason or we should go with faith? Very important question. Today we still are talking about it. No compromises inside. So is religion responsible for ethics? Or can philosophy devoid of religion answer this question? So he was advocating that, so he was dealing with the question, can we find the truth via religion or via philosophy? So, and he advocated that faith and reason must converge. Well, we have to find, Aquinas was saying, we have to find a way to reconcile religious belief with philosophical reasoning. Otherwise, we cannot do it. I cannot disagree with him because most people on this planet are religious. Philosophers and intellectuals are in absolute minority. According to the Plato, that doesn't matter because we need enlightened people to lead. But that clearly has not worked out. Look at our southern neighbor. That has not worked out. It's so difficult to find enlightened leaders. And it's very unlikely that a society can be ethical as a total just by having enlightened leaders. So we have to move as one entity. We cannot just rely on some leaders. So very, very serious questions. So then we come to another Thomas Hobbes, around 1588 to 1679. So these are tough times, don't forget that. So we just passed the dark ages. Nothing was going on, just killing, and people were killing each other just because they disagreed in the way that they would do their prayers. And then you would have 60 years of wars going on and a lot of atrocities. So having these guys to sit down and talk, you don't need to agree with them to appreciate them. If you are an intellectual and you don't like religious people, that's fine, or vice versa. But these guys were serious. They sit down to find solutions in the framework of their own mind. So Thomas Hobbes, he came up with the idea that people, I don't know if it's an idea, but maybe an observation, people behave out of their own selfish interest. Wow, that's an observation. So somebody needed to write it down, that we act out of our selfish interest. So he coined that, or we coin it as social atomism. So each one of us as an individual are like an atom, and we act and behave and move according to our own selfish interest. Has anything changed in that regard? Doesn't look like it. especially the Western society, we put a lot of emphasis on individuals, a lot of emphasis on, we say responsibility, but actually responsibility negates individuality. Responsibility is putting yourself aside for sake of others. So there is some contradiction in that when we say that. So, but the social atomism is everywhere. So is it our nature? What means nature? Is it the influence of the society? What happened after Industrial Revolution? People are thinking about that. People are writing about that. It's not that easy. So he proposed social contract. To remedy social violence. To remedy violence, basically. He said, guys, okay, look, I know if philosophers hear me say that, say, don't make it that simple. It's not that simple. I know. So, but we are putting it in a way that it is. It means what? It means, guys, we are selfish beings, but we ought to live together. So let's come up with a contract, a social contract. So let's put the red light, and when you get at the red light, we stop. So you give up your own freedom, your selfish interest that you want to get home to the house of your grandpa for Christmas party, and you stop for sake of others to pass. So you give up a piece of your selfish interest for sake of others to live together. You can extend that to bigger events like wars. So let's have a social contract. Let's talk. Let's have a United Nations. Let's have embassies. So the United Nations was called League of Nations. That was created after the First World War. And after the First World War, we realized, still after the Second World War, we had the ministries of war. One of the big changes we made after the Second World War, we called it Ministry of Defense. It's not Ministry of War again. It was a shift in the consciousness, in the ethical perception of things. But was it enough? Well, many would disagree that this was enough. Okay. You're realizing I'm just really flying over this. There is no way that we can explain Thomas Hobbes in the two words that I'm just grabbing there. But we want to establish a base. We want to establish a base. You can write 2-3 PhDs on Thomas Hobbes. People are making career based on the thoughts of Thomas Hobbes, and they don't mention that they are doing that. So, of course, we have to get to John Locke. John Locke, 1632 to 1704. So John Locke is very important, again, because many things that we have right now, right here in North America, is because of John Locke. So he advocated that we have God-given rights. So you may understand this in any way you want. So if you are secular or atheist, you don't like the word God, so be it. That doesn't matter. So, but if we can secure some rights, some ethical principles, by saying that there is a divine force behind it, this has worked in many situations. It worked. At some level, it worked. And we were actually able, if you believe in that, then you may be able to enforce a social contract. So that, like Thomas Hobbes was advocating. So property was a huge thing for John Locke. He said property is beneficial for the entire society. So what is the relationship between property and ethics? Why do you want to have a car? Why do you want to have a Ferrari? You want to enjoy it. It's about pleasure. Owning stuff is some of it is physical security. I need to own a house, if I can. Or I rent a house, a place, shelter. So that's physical security. That's minimum requirements to live as a human being. But a car is pleasure. A house of a certain level in excess, in the terminology of Aristotle, is pleasure. It's not a need that I have a house of 10 rooms. So, but declaring that property is beneficial to everybody, to the society. So if everybody can have a minimum level of pleasure, everybody is relaxed. There will be not much conflict. So everybody feels that you are benefiting from the society. His ideas of property and other ideas are in the US Constitution. John Locke is the initiator of enlightenment in France and England. So, and for some of the people, it's really difficult to see the relationship between securing property and having ethical behavior. Very important. Is it ethical to steal? So is related to the question of property. So you cannot answer that. It was immensely important in that period of time. The results of this idea came 200-300 years afterwards. We do not move fast. We need a lot of time to establish things in the human society. So then perhaps these are my selections. I'm skipping many other thinkers. Just picking my own biases. I have certainly biases, so I have picked my favorite ones. So one of my favorites, Baruch Spinoza. Spinoza, 1632 to 1677, not a long life. Yeah, when you get in conflict with your own religious community and they excommunicate you and you have to do this and that, so that takes a toll on you. That's difficult when your own people reject you. Very difficult. But you may have to do this. If you are dealing with ethics, do not expect applause, because you are going after the core of being a human being. So he wrote a book, Ethics. His masterpiece is Ethics. He said, guys, the problem is we have to bring in science. And science was predominantly mathematics. He said, let's formulate ethical rules as geometrical axioms. And he attempted that. Is really just take the first page of Ethics. Read the first page. So if you have a little bit of scientific passion in you, you will continue. You will continue. This is not a boring philosophical treatise. So it's amazing that somebody came with the idea, let's formulate ethical rules as scientific axioms. So attempt to scientifically or geometrically formulate ethics or ethical rules. So, as much as is a joy to read, and Spinoza is a very colorful figure in human history, it didn't solve our problem. Because the problem was not formulation. So the problem was not how do we formulate it. The problem is to reach a consensus. That's the problem. We don't have a consensus. And how can you talk about AI and ethics if we don't know what ethics are we talking about? Are we talking about the Aristotelian ethics or Socratic ethics or Platonic ethics? What ethics are we talking about? So, okay. Then we come to Immanuel Kant, 1724, 1804. A very strange figure. 30 years in his own village, didn't go anywhere, didn't visit other cities, didn't know other cultures, just sat down, went twice a day for a walk. People would correct their clock based on his walking time. He was so precise. So, and he was looking at the method, the tool with which we are trying to establish ethics. So he rejected happiness as motivation for life, as motivation for ethics. So if you reject something that Aristotle has said, you have guts. Because, wow, you are going against 2,000 years of tradition. But if you are sitting like him in your village, quiet, silence, go for a walk, you couldn't care less. He didn't want to be the part of the enlightened leaders to lead the perfect state. So he was just pondering. So he is part of, but he suggested instead duty. We should do things out of duty, out of responsibility, out of morality. So, and he uses the so-called moral argument even to prove that there is a God. So not the ontological argument that there is order, therefore there is God. Not the cosmological argument, but the moral argument. There is a God because things appear to be, some of them moral, some of them immoral, so somebody must have put them in place. A very, very new type of argument for answering the ontological question. So he suggested duty. Sounds very boring. Well, but it's not. So he's the part of the ontology. The deontological ethics, so the deon means duty, and so is a type of normative ethics that judges the morality of an action based on rules. Based on rules. So his famous work is the Kritik der reinen Vernunft, the critic of the pure reasoning. And he advocates the point of view that you cannot get to everything just with reasoning. And he basically says what we use in recursion, you gotta believe. You have to have some faith. You have to see. If you see, you will believe. Because we see every human being knows killing is wrong. Why do you know that? Somebody has put it in place. It must have come from somewhere. So that's what Kant says. Interesting. I had difficult times to get to the middle of his books 2-3 times. So, but it's a good read. So okay, we get to really difficult cases. Arthur Schopenhauer. All these guys were academicians and serious people, and then somebody comes like a Schopenhauer. He is a rebel. He doesn't care. He is a radical. So I said, well, what you call ethics is not ethics at all. What it means courage. Killing other people is courage. He questions everything. For that, of course, people don't like him. So 1788 to 1860. The times I write because it matters. You have to know where, what time, in what timeline he was saying this. So basically, he says the world is not a rational place. And is full of suffering. He could have uttered these words yesterday. You look at what's going on in Africa, in Middle East, anywhere place, at any time. You read that the world is not a rational place and full of suffering. Who could have said that? If you ask this question in India and China, people say, Buddha? Did Buddha say that? No, Schopenhauer. So he was not a very happy guy. He was not a happy guy. Maybe because he was very sensitive. So if you see and perceive all those strife and suffering that he is pointing to, and we all see that, and you are really deeply sensitive, it takes a toll on you. He didn't marry, he didn't have a friend, he lived with his mom for a long time, he had problems with many people, he was in conflict with many people. Schopenhauer is, perhaps after Spinoza, my favorite, so I go back to just get refreshed. So you can be a rebel. You can question everything. So, and he says to reduce suffering, we ought to minimize our desires. So now I'm telling you, this is not Schopenhauer, this is Buddha speaking. Suffering, desire. But you know, if things are right, it doesn't matter. There is no East and West. If there is such a thing as truth, the truth is true everywhere. So maybe you just open your eyes and see it with the cultural glasses that you have on. But you see it, if you want to see. So his work that is very important is über die Grundlage der Moral. About the foundations of the morality. So it's his famous book. I would say it's not a totally easy read, but it's good. So you read this and you hear, oh my God, philosophy can be exciting. It's not boring. It's not boring at all. So he argues that ethics, in this book, he argues that ethics emerges from compassion. Wow. He was a spiritual leader or what? No. He is very straightforward, very objective, very scientific, if you like, very logical. Goes back to reasoning again and again. It's really tough to argue with him. It's really tough to argue with him. And it's strange because he talks about suffering and compassion in a very non-compassionate way. So this type of words have been reserved for millennia for Eastern philosophy. Compassion, suffering. But now somebody like Schopenhauer is talking about that. Is really refreshing. It's really refreshing. You see, so if Thomas Aquinas could be here, say, okay, guy, this is what I was talking about, the converging of faith and reason. This is one of them. But you would say that if you take somebody like Aquinas, looking at somebody like Schopenhauer, he would never say that. These are worlds apart. But both of them occupied with the question of ethics. What is right? What is wrong? Okay. We come to Jeremy Bentham. We are around 1748 to 1832. He says we are motivated by pleasure. Well, That was not new, was it? No, he goes deeper. He takes a look at it, and he tries to explain pleasure with mathematics. He writes a book, The Calculus of Pleasure. So I started 2-3 times to read that, and I was conflicted. I was looking really for calculus, but then I would find a strange notion of philosophy, so I gave up again and again. So I have to go back and read it to the end. But it's something that he really thinks is the way to go. The question is, about suffering, he says, that the question is not can they think? Or nor can they reason? But can they suffer? So now, for the first time, he makes the connection. This is the significance of Bentham in my view. For the first, many people have talked about suffering. And of course, one of the ethical things is we don't want to inflict suffering. Most people would agree. We should not inflict suffering on each other, on animals. But then some people say we should not unnecessarily inflict suffering. And then they start quoting, oh, okay, if somebody's like Hitler, then we have to inflict suffering because for a larger good. We get to that argument. First time Bentham made the connection, who has the right to be ethically treated? Until that point, we would say anybody who can reason and can think, so human beings. So what about people who are not sane? What about disabled people? What about very old people? What about children? What about animals? Should animals expect, or should we extend our ethical behavior to animals? They cannot reason, they cannot think, they don't have rights to vote. Why should be part of the ethical circle? Bentham said, for the first time, that argument of suffering is very important, that if you can suffer, you can ask for ethical behavior. You should be in that circle of compassion, not just humans, not just sane human adults, also disabled people, also people with Alzheimer's, also women. It's not so obvious if you go back 150 years. Women got voting rights in France 1944. So we are far away from claiming that women are now have equal rights. What about animals? They cannot even talk. They cannot even express that they have also the right to live on this planet without being subject to suffering. So if you do that, okay, so our ethics that we have is not applicable to them. But he does not go deep into it. Into this topic. He is one of the founders of the concept of utility, the utilitarianism, which says whatever is useful is good. So, and that comes right after him. Of course, John Stuart Mill. With him, utilitarianism has started, so 1806 to 1873. So this is mainly about the concept of utility. And utility means basically usefulness. If useful, then right. If something is useful, it is right. It's the dominant culture mainly in the Western Hemisphere, but also in big part of the Eastern Hemisphere, if there is such a divide. The utilitarianism says whatever is useful for us has to be good, has to be right. So this can have some issues. So he also wrote his masterpiece on liberty, because he advocated political freedom. He realized actually you cannot talk about any of this stuff unless you have freedom to speak, the freedom of expression. If you cannot talk about stuff, if people put you in jail because you question some ethical notions, then there is no progress. So he put some of his efforts on liberty, political liberty. What is political liberty? He was one of the first that pointed to the idea of the dictatorship of majority. What is democracy? So if 98% of us are straight, so we can suppress homosexuals because they are just 1% of the society? So what does it mean to be democratic? On liberty, this is by far the magnum opus of political writings that I have read. Every sentence is a joy. Just take a look at the first page again on the liberty. It's fantastic. This guy is a genius in writing English phrases. It's fantastic to read. It's really, really enjoyable. It has not necessarily directly something to do with ethics, but is the prerequisite to find the space and time to talk about ethics. And he realized that, which was very important. So in this idea, the locus of right and wrong is put on outcome. So anywhere that you see the right and wrongness of things being judged based on their outcome, this is a utilitarian view of things. If the outcome is good, it must be ethical. And now, because don't think about trivial stuff. One of the famous examples people use, and we go after drastic examples, we grab Nazis. So Nazis come to a village, some resistance fighters have been hiding in that village. They come, capture the mayor of that village, and say, if you don't give us the resistance fighter, every 10 minutes we will kill 10 people. So moral dilemma for the mayor. Should I give up 3 resistance fighters to be dead? Or should I let every 10 minutes 10 people die? These are made up, invented, drastic, exaggerated cases. Of course, the problems that we have in human society are not of that nature. They are sporadic, they are outliers. But you ask these philosophical questions to make a point. A utilitarian approach would say, yes, give up the resistance fighter. Let the freedom fighter be killed by the Nazis to save 500 villagers. Outcome, utility. Sounds brutal, but what would you do in that situation? People would ask. So, of course, it's not that easy in the reality to answer those type of questions. Okay, last one. Well, last one in my selection, in my subjectively biased selection, Ludwig Wittgenstein, 1889, 1951. A very strange one. The guy was not even a philosopher. The guy didn't even have that type of academic, clear, nice academic career to become a philosopher. He didn't even have any major publication. And his first book, Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, a treatise on logic and philosophy, has become a classic. So imagine, you don't even have a career in philosophy. You write one book, it becomes the classic. What was that? So it's about words and images. And the first sentence in his Tractatus is, the world is all that is the case. So the world is all that is the case. So what Wittgenstein realized was this: a lot of problems that we have, starting from Socrates. Again, you're talking, if I want to include everybody, okay, let's start from Buddha, Confucius, come to Middle East, Abu Sa'id Abu Khair, Bayezid Bastami, come to Socrates, come forward up to Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. He realized we have a problem. The issue that we cannot establish a good, clear understanding of ethics is because of language. What about language? So you say a word, and because you have an image of that word in your mind, I have a totally different image of that word. That's the reason we cannot get together. We cannot come to a compromise. So another thing is that a proposition is a picture of reality. Whatever you propose as ethical or any type of assertion is an image that you have from the reality. Is not the reality itself. It's an image. So how do you know that your image is compatible with my image? If you have different images from the same reality, we cannot get to a baseline of ethics. The intercultural differences, simplified, expressed. It's deeper than that. It's much deeper than that. You could be a member of the same culture, but still have different images because you grew up in different cities, in different families, under different economical circumstances. The images that we develop from the reality are different. So everything that we propose is different because that comes, doesn't matter you do deduction or you do induction. It's different because the divide is not starting from the books. The divide starts from here because the images are different. It took us a while to understand what he's saying. He's saying it, as you can imagine, he's saying it, I don't mean any disrespect. I mean it as a compliment. He's saying it in a German way. Super logical. So, and then if you want to get to the bottom of it, you have to read it 5 times. I said, what? The world is all that is the case. What do you mean? The world is what it is. So the reality is what it is. The reality doesn't change because of my images. I cannot change the reality. So what we cannot speak about, we must pass over. In silence. Is it again Buddha speaking? No, it's Ludwig Wittgenstein, the Austrian philosopher, who was not a philosopher. What we cannot speak about, we must pass over in silence. Who does that? We write books after books. We have debates, the most useless form of communication, debates. We get together, we change some argue, my people applaud me, your people applaud you, and we go home. Fantastic. It's entertainment. Debates are entertainment. They are not a serious way. They are not dialogues. If you want to have a dialogue, you have to start with somebody like this. Let's get to the bottom of things. Do we have the same image of the reality? Are you willing, in tradition of Socrates, to question everything? Are you? If you are not, if you're just clinging to your beliefs, okay, there is no dialogue. Then you go your way, I go my way, which has been the case for the past 12,000 years of human civilization. So there is no way that we can answer AI questions without putting this in this context. In this context. I have to look at some of this. At least I have to assemble something in my mind. Again, it's absolutely ridiculous what we do, that we have ethics exams. Exam? You go there and I know what I would do, but of course I would not cross it here in the PEO exam. I would not, so I would cross here. You cannot make people behave ethically by having a license. It's deeper than that. We have to think about this. We have to engage with this type of behavior. So we don't have much time, but just to give you at least one or two ideas about how things can be challenged, I give you the last one. For example, we say, what type of ethics you have, and what is the moral grounding? What are you basing your ethics upon? And then some criticism. So, and I just mentioned one of them. I had more, but we don't have time. So let's go with the utilitarianism. Utilitarianism. So the concept of utility. What is the moral ground? The moral ground is outcome, which is behavioral consequences, basically. So when we saw, one of the major discussions in the ethics is the grounding. What is your ground? So one ground could be divine commands. God told me to. One ground is natural laws. One ground is utility. So whatever is, one ground is virtue ethics, as Aristotle was saying. So whatever is a virtue is a good ground for ethics. And deontology, moral itself, duty, responsibility. So the utilitarianism says the outcome is my moral ground. I'm very objective. I'm driven by the facts. I look at the outcome. Whatever is useful, we take that. Whatever is useful for all of us, for the society at large, for the human society at large, must be ethical. Okay? One of the criticism, or the major criticism, is the so-called repugnant conclusion. This was put in place by Derek Parfit, the English philosopher. What is the repugnant conclusion? You look at the utilitarianism and you say, yeah, that makes sense. That's practical approach. So whatever is useful for the campus, we do it for the campus. If some faculty member or some students don't like it, okay, so but it's useful for the campus as large. Whatever is good for Canada, we do it for Canada. So if our southern neighbor don't like it, okay, so be it. So we cannot make everybody happy and satisfied. So based on the concept of utility, you could say, if I have two groups of people on this planet, one is a small group, 50 million people. Let's say in North America, we are 350 million people in North America. And we can go two ways. We establish a high quality society for this minority in North America. Or we establish an average and below average minimum quality for everybody on planet. Based on the concept of utility, we have to go with the first one. To hell with everybody else, that would be the outcome. We go rather with a small society that has higher quality outcome. And that's the reason that we call it a repugnant conclusion, because it is repugnant. But it can come to that conclusion if you go with total utilitarianism. Not even the hedonistic utilitarianism. So if you completely, absolutely enforce this idea, you may get to that. Of course, like any other example, that never happens. But some of it could happen. If I'm going to war against other country and say, I have the outcome for my country and I have the outcome for other group. So is the problem of the utility that we don't apply it at humanity at large? We only apply it on our group of people. Is that the problem? If I apply consistently the concept of utility on everybody, on human society, would that solve the problem? Or I have an ethnic understanding of utility, which appears to be. We have 180 countries something. We have national boundaries. We have passport. You cannot easily go to Mexico, to China. You need a visa. They need a visa for us. Things are divided. So the concept of utility is locally applied. What is then the implication for ethics? So there are other ones that, for example, the divine laws. When you say, okay, we have divine laws, it comes from a supernatural supreme being, and we accept that. What could be the critique of that? That's one of the dilemmas that Socrates in his dialogues points to, and it's a dilemma that says, okay, are you pious because gods love you, or gods love you because you are pious? Which one is it? So you are pious by yourself, detached from the attention of gods, and that's the reason that gods like you, or gods like you because you are pious. So that's one of the critiques that we can utter if we talk about the divine grounding for ethics. Grounding means, okay, what is the reason that you are saying that? And I say, God says so in my script. So any grounding could be questioned in some way. And we may freak out if we are dependent on that grounding, or we may just sit down and think about it. I thought we should mention some of this. And hopefully on Tuesday, we want to then go explicitly into AI cases. Now it makes sense to talk about what happened here, what happened there, when we had AI entities, AI robots, and something went wrong, and some damage, some suffering was done. Was it right? What is wrong? What is the implication was? We will talk about that on Tuesday.